So welcome to Jazz Chat with David Friesen. Welcome. We have a really very special guest with us today. Seattle journalist Paul de Barros has interviewed every jazz legend you can think of and covers festivals around the world. He writes a weekly column for the Seattle Times and is a contributor to Downbeat Jazz magazine. His 1993 book, Jackson Street After Hours, The Roots of Jazz in Seattle, is a tribute to the rich musical history of his adopted hometown and digs deep into its social and political context. Please welcome Paul de Barros. How are you?
I'm fine. Thank you so much for having me, David.
Of course. Was that all true, what I just read?
The only part that's not true anymore is that I retired from a full-time job at the Seattle Times 4 years ago. And so now I write maybe only once a month or so about various things. So I'm a regular contributor, but not a columnist.
Okay.
And I do write for Earshot magazine a lot now too, which is of course receptive to the local scene because it's a local organization.
Right, of course. They've been around for quite a while.
I started the magazine in 1984 with Gary Bannister.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Quite a while.
Quite a while. And when this, it said that Seattle was your adopted town. Where were you from originally?
Well, I was born in LA and my family moved to Northern California when I was 5. So I basically grew up in the Bay Area. I'm really a San Francisco Bay Area boy. I grew up in Palo Alto. I went to Scott College in Berkeley in San Francisco, lived in San Francisco, Sausalito, Berkeley, Oakland, and didn't really come to Seattle until 1979.
So you remember the Keystone Corner, of course. Then.
Of course.
Yeah. And Yoshis, probably.
Yeah, although, actually, I didn't visit Yoshis until I went down there from Seattle.
Okay.
I'm not even sure when Yoshis opened.
I knew Yoshi. I knew her personally when she had her little Japanese restaurant, and there was a good friend of hers who was a shakuhachi player, a Japanese style flute, 4-hole flute, with a tradition of about 2,000 years. Anyways, he played shakuhachi. He was very good friends with Yoshi and introduced me to her. And I think I did a gig at her little restaurant before there was any Yoshis Jazz Club.
That rings a bell because I remember doing one of the most fun stories I ever got to write for the Alaska Airlines in-flight magazine. And they said, we want to give you an open-ended ticket to visit every jazz club on the West Coast and we'll pay for everything.
Wow. Wow.
So sometime in the early 80s. So that really was a networking opportunity that was just priceless. And that's when I first met Yoshi, somewhere around 83, somewhere like that.
Wow. Paul, this is a question I ask all the guests that I'm talking with, but it's interesting to hear how everyone is dealing with the pandemic and how you have fared and navigated through this obstacle in our lives. How's it been for you?
Well, I think it's just been awful, like it's been for everybody else. I haven't heard anybody play live music in over a year. It's very difficult, as I'm sure you've found, and other fans and listeners and writers and musicians have found, to really get deeply involved in a broadcast on your laptop. I mean, I try, but it's been like a starvation period. I've been very lucky personally because I'm older and I'm semi-retired. I still write, but I don't have to make a living. If I had to make a living as a writer right now about jazz and popular music, I would really be as up a creek as most of you all are, sitting around with nowhere to play.
Yeah, we do the live stream, and the people were very excited about live stream for a while and was willing to donate money and support, but after after a while, everyone's doing live stream, and
Yeah.
they're, you know, the audience is saturated, and you just can't make a living that way.
No.
You know,
I mean, it was exciting for a moment when you realized, oh, I don't have to go to New York to see who's playing at the Vanguard, but
exactly.
and people could tune in from Latvia or whatever. But yeah, the novelty wore off. You're
Yeah,
right.
it's not the same as being there. Um, why journalism? Why? How'd you start in that direction?
That's a complicated question for me. I was always interested in journalism. In junior high, I wrote for the paper, and in at the University of California, I wrote music reviews of the Monterey Jazz Festival, and the first review of the Jefferson Airplane in the Bay Area, and I was very, very admiring of a journalist at the San Francisco Chronicle named Ralph J. Gleason,
Sure.
and got to know him a little bit. And he was kind of an inspiration because as a 14-year-old, he was the only guy writing for the San Francisco Chronicle who would say something was a real gas. And I thought, wow, I think I should get to know this guy.
He was a great. I knew Ralph quite well. He's a great person.
He was a great person, a great advocate of the music, and an
Yeah.
extremely open-minded guy.
Yeah.
Here was a guy who was really expert in jazz, and yet he really, really sympathized in a deep way with working musicians of all kinds,
Yeah.
country
Yeah.
musicians, rock musicians. And he'd lived through that era when jazz was popular, when it was the swing era.
Mm.
And he loved, the Woody Herman Second Herd, and he loved that kind of peak of bebop when it was popular as well. And so when the Fillmore rock revolution happened and the British invasion happened, he jumped right on it. And a lot of jazz people just turned up their nose. How can you write about this garbage? And I realized, oh, here's a second reason why this is my guy, because I grew up playing and loving jazz, but I also grew up playing and loving rock and roll.
Yeah. Why not? You know, yeah, he was one of the few people that supported my solo bass concerts in the early 70s. I mean, no one was really doing them, and I started doing this in the early 70s, and he was right there supporting me. He's one of the few journalists that stepped up to the plate. He was great.
But as far as my own story in journalism, after that year or so of writing about jazz and pop music for the Daily Cal at the University of California, I became really more interested in writing fiction and poetry. And I thought, geez, I don't want to just be on the sidelines writing about other artists. I want to be an artist too. And so I wrote a lot of fiction. I went to South America and I kept a journal on the advice of a great Irish poet named James Liddy, who had been my teacher at San Francisco State. And he said, just write every day and you'll find something. And so I published a couple of books, a book of short stories along with a revised version of that journal. And for a long time, I really was not that interested in journalism. Having a family and suddenly having the need to make a living.
Yeah.
When I moved to Seattle in 1979, I was like, okay, I want to keep writing fiction, but nobody's paying me to do that. I was editing a very esoteric literary magazine, sort of on the par in the jazz world of being on a very small label where 300 people are buying your album, if that.
It's a lot today.
Yeah, and that's a lot today. And so I just kind of fell back into journalism. I went to the Weekly, which was now the Seattle Weekly and may not even exist anymore except online. And the editor there said, well, do you know anything about jazz? And I said, well, yeah, I know quite a bit about it. He said, well, we're having a bit of a jazz renaissance here in Seattle. How would you like to write a cover story about Ernestine Anderson? And I said, yeah, I think I could handle that. And I went over to Ernestine's house, the great Seattle singer, and she was friendly and wonderful. And I did the cover story. And suddenly I was getting calls from Downbeat saying, do you want to write for us? And everybody kind of was in favor of what I was doing. And I thought, well, this is nice. People are calling me up and offering me a check.
Yeah.
So, and it's something that came naturally to me. To back up to a little more esoteric part of it, when I was editing that magazine, I was living in Vancouver, British Columbia, and I was listening to a lot of avant-garde music. Kind of fell into a scene with a lot of poets there who were listening to the Art Ensemble of Chicago and what turned out to be one of my favorite albums of all time, Dave Holland's Conference of the Birds, Arthur Blythe, who was just coming on the scene, and of course, Keith Jarrett, who was more accessible than a lot of those other people. And I remember one night just started writing a poem listening to a Keith Jarrett record. And I looked back at it a few days later and I realized, oh, you actually have the ability to see this music in your mind as pictures because you understand how the instruments are played. I don't know how to describe it exactly, but because I'd had my fingers on the saxophone and the clarinet and the piano, I could sort of hear the musical figures as shapes and see them. And that came out in this poem. So when I started writing about music in journalism, less poetically, I realized that's a facility that you can use and that comes naturally to you and feels good. So that's a more holistic description of how I got into it.
How about your relationship with the editors?
You know,
have you had a problem at all with that?
I would compare that to your experience with producers. It's, you know, you find a label, you love a producer who says, wow, I get what you're doing. Do you want to try this? Or you have a producer who says, here, I want you to play this tune. We need this as the first cut. No, that stinks. I don't like it. That's the whole range of editors. And I've had brilliant ones and I have had terrible.
Yeah, I did a album once in New York for CTI. It was with Joe Henderson, Art Farmer. There were two bass players. There was a bass player that played electric bass on the David Letterman show. I forget his name now. And who was on drums? Al Foster, I think, was on drums. And the producers, it was Art Farmer's date, but they were raking him over the coals as producer. Not wanting this, not wanting him to play this, that, this. And you want to record Art Farmer, let him be Art Farmer, you know.
Later, when I became an editor at the Seattle Times, and first at Earshot, but later at the Seattle Times, my credo was, here you have this person writing in a particular voice with a particular point of view. Your job is to make that point of view and that voice as clear and accessible and as good as possible.
Yeah.
Not to change it, not to say, well, why don't you think that? Or why don't you use this word instead of that word? It's to ask questions. Yeah. And I've had editors like that. I've had wonderful editors who do that. And I've had horrible editors who change your copy and don't even tell you. And suddenly you're reading an article by you that looks like it's by somebody else.
Yeah. Were you ever at the Penthouse? Did you remember the Penthouse?
No, I actually was. I went to the Penthouse in Seattle, and I've been trying to pin this down. It was either the summer '64 or the summer '65. My uncle was a career Army officer, and he was stationed in Korea for 13 months. And so his wife was down at Fort Lewis in Lakewood. I was in college in Berkeley, and my roommate and I drove up to visit her and just hang out for the summer because we wanted to see the area. And she was a terrific woman, and she set us up with these blind dates. We got to go to the Evergreen Ballroom and see this rock band that I thought, wow, that's a lot like my rock band, except these guys seem to be really serious about their career. And that turned out to be a group called the Sonics, which is a legendary rock and roll band in this area. And then we went up to Seattle and we found this jazz club, and Buddy Montgomery was playing there. Sure. And we asked if we could come in, and they said, sure. They didn't ask for ID. We were like 17 or 18 years old. We sat down, we talked to Buddy. And yeah, I remember the place. It had a real nice vibe. I'm sure you were there.
Well, I worked the Saturday sessions with Joe Brazil, who kind of took me under his wing when I came in from the Army to Seattle. And my first gig there was with at Pete's Hoop Det.
Oh, perfect. I was never
with
there, but I knew about that.
With Joe, and then the Penthouse with George Griffin on drums, Mike Mandel on piano, George Griffin and myself, and sometimes Jerry Heldman would also play bass, so there'd be two bass players.
We've got to talk more about this if we didn't in our interview for Jackson Street, because I'm doing a follow-up book called After Jackson. And I've just been looking over a lot of stuff from the 60s. And I'd love to get a more detailed description in the book of what it felt like to be playing the Penthouse.
I think you wrote a little bit about the Longland, Jerry Heldman's club.
I did.
Across from me. I have a lot of stories about my time there. Seattle has been in the news lately, as has Portland, Oregon. And both of our cities have had this huge protest, perverse type of protest that has affected a lot of people. Were you affected by this? Did you have a problem driving or come into contact with?
No, the occupation of Cal Anderson Park was pretty localized. I have to say that historically, having lived as long as I have and having been at People's Park in Berkeley, occupying a public place and claiming it for the counterculture, and realizing later in my older middle age that what we did was probably stupid, especially when I look at what that park is now. I kind of felt pretty alienated from, certainly not from what people were protesting. I mean, Black Lives Matter movement has been a great positive thing, but the way in which people went about taking over a part of a city and imagining in some kind of utopian way that they could run the place better than the powers that be was certainly proved wrong immediately when several people were shot and killed.
Yeah.
It was very sad to watch.
Yeah, here in Portland also. I haven't been down in downtown Portland for over a year. My son David said he walked down there last week. He said it's like a war zone. Everything's boarded up. It's just a totally different city.
It's sad. Yeah, I haven't been to Portland in more than a year.
It's very sad. This is a short interview. My interviews are short; they're about 20 minutes in length.
Okay.
You've really provided the viewers with some really special insight to yourself, and you've used more than 2-syllable words, which is.
I hope they weren't too long.
No. It's been great. I always have our guests end with this, what I'm going to ask you to share with the people. In a broken world that we're living in right now, can you leave the viewers with some words of hope and encouragement?
I can, and I would echo what I saw in the Academy Awards last night. A fellow who won the Humanitarian Award runs a studio in Atlanta, and he gave one of the most moving speeches I've heard in a long time.
Yeah.
In which he said, stand against hate and stand in the middle of the room, stand at the center, because that's where hate dissolves. And that's where I stand, and that's what I encourage everybody to do. And that goes for all of us, you know. Don't hate Trump voters. Don't hate the people that invaded the Capitol. Don't hate anybody.
Right.
Love is the answer. Love is the answer. We know that. It's just so hard to live it.
I was being interviewed one time by a writer, and the writer says, "Oh, I can't believe I'm sitting next to David Friesen. He was a fan." And I said, listen, the person that you should be talking about like that is the individual that can show mercy to another.
That's it.
That's
I
it.
agree.
Kindness and mercy. You never know what the other person is going through, who they've lost, what their history is. You know,
That's so true. My former editor at the Seattle Times, white, and her brother, white, obviously, was walking down the street one day, and a black man walking by with a baseball bat whacked him over the head and really hurt him. And she asked him, well, how do you feel about this? And she said, well, you never know what he was going through. He had his reasons. Now, I don't think I could achieve that level of humility, but I would aspire to it.
well, we could talk forever. I could just sit and listen to you forever and enjoy the whole conversation like a film. Thank you so much for being willing to do this interview with me for my jazz chat with David Friesen, and I wish you well. All my fans, please be well, stay healthy, and God bless you all.
Thank you so much, David, and to you too.
Thanks a lot, Paul.
Okay, bye-bye.